The fastest way to stay ordinary with money is to treat all debt as if it were the same animal. It is not. A mortgage at 3% is not the same as a credit card at 24%. A fixed federal student loan is not the same as a payday advance. A cheap auto loan that leaves your cash free to compound is not the same as consumer debt that compounds against you. Yet millions of people still dump every liability into one ugly pile, glare at the whole thing with moral disgust, and decide that the honorable path is to attack every debt as aggressively as possible until the balance sheet looks clean. That sounds responsible. It often produces mediocre lives. I do not admire clean looking balance sheets if the road used to create them was financially foolish. I do not admire the man who arrives debt-free at 50 with too little capital, too little optionality, too little liquidity, and too little compounding behind him because he spent 20 years murdering cheap debt while starving productive assets. That man is not strong. He is simply late. I have spent my life around capital, businesses, rates, and the strange moral language people wrap around money when they do not fully understand what money costs. One of the biggest lessons I ever learned is that debt is not a moral category. Debt is a pricing category. That distinction changes everything. Most people were taught debt as a commandment, debt bad, pay it off, feel virtuous. Sleep well, fine. That is how parents talk. That is how television talks. That is how personal finance gets simplified for mass audiences. But a simplification can still be expensive. If debt costs you 3% and your investable capital can reasonably compound at 10% over long periods, then treating that debt as an emergency is not discipline. It is a misunderstanding of opportunity cost. On the other hand, if debt costs you 25%, then carrying it while pretending you are an investor is financial theater. That is not leverage. That is self-destruction dressed in monthly installments. I do not want people thinking morally about debt. I want them thinking mathematically. That is the adult way to think, not how does this make me feel? What is the actual cost of this capital? What is the likely return on the alternative use of this money? What flexibility does this debt preserve? What flexibility does this debt destroy? What am I really optimizing for? Because the point is not to die with the fewest monthly payments. The point is to build wealth. And wealth is not built by winning the wrong contest. I have known many people who were obsessed with becoming debt-free and somehow never became free in any real sense at all. Their house was paid off. Yes, their investment accounts were small. Their cash position was weak. Their income options were limited. Their stress remained high. Their life still had no margin. That is what happens when somebody confuses eliminating a liability with building an asset base. They are not the same activity. One can help the other, of course, but only if you know which liabilities deserve your aggression and which ones merely deserve timely discipline. Minimum payments while your money goes somewhere more productive, that is the entire subject. And I think it is one of the most misunderstood subjects in personal finance. So let me say the blunt part early. There are several kinds of debt that many people are paying down too aggressively right now, and that mistake is costing them far more than the interest they are saving. Then there is the other kind of debt, the kind that should be attacked like a fire in the walls. If you do not know the difference, you may spend 20 years feeling responsible while quietly making yourself poorer than you needed to be. That is not a small mistake. That is a life-shaping mistake. The first debt too many people attack emotionally is a low-interest mortgage. This is the one that enrages people when you tell the truth about it, because housing is one of the places where culture, morality, family advice, and financial math all collide in a loud, ugly knot. People love saying your house should be paid off as fast as possible. Parents say it, neighbors say it. People who never once calculated the opportunity cost say it with enormous confidence. The sentence sounds wise because it contains emotional comfort. A paid-off house feels permanent. It feels safe. It feels like adulthood done correctly. And if I am discussing a 78-year-old widow with no income variability, then yes, a paid-off home may be a very beautiful thing. But that is not the same as saying that every 42-year-old with a 3.5% mortgage should be shoveling every spare dollar into principal. That is madness. You need to understand what that mortgage actually is. If you locked in a mortgage in the era when money was abnormally cheap, what you may be holding is some of the cheapest long-duration capital you will ever see in your life. A 30-year fixed mortgage at 2.5%, 3%, or even 4% is not just debt. It is a financial asset from your perspective, because the lender gave you long-term money at a rate that history may not offer again for a very long time. Now here is the question ordinary people almost never ask. If I do not prepay that cheap debt, what can the money do elsewhere? That is the whole game. Suppose you have a mortgage around 3.5% and you decide to send an extra $500 a month to principal because you want to be good. What exactly are you earning on that $500, roughly speaking? You are earning the avoided interest rate. That is the effective return. You are using capital to lock in a 3.5% outcome. Fine, that is safe. It is also mediocre if the rest of your financial life still needs to be built. If instead that same $500 a month goes into a broad low-cost equity index fund and compounds at something closer to long run market returns over decades, the spread between those two decisions can become enormous. Not academically enormous, life-changing enormous. The source text rightly emphasizes this spread thinking, and that is the correct lens. Cheap debt versus higher expected long-run return on productive assets is not an emotional contest. It is a capital allocation decision. Content reference OEA site. One fei inde, fei one fei people always object here. They say yes, but paying off the house gives certainty. Yes, it does. And certainty has value, but certainty is not free. You are purchasing that emotional certainty with foregone compounding. That might be worth it to some people. It is not automatically worth it. The real mistake is when people buy certainty before they have built strength. A 45-year-old with little in retirement savings, little liquidity, and a very cheap mortgage should not be using his best free cash flow to become more home. Equity rich and more investment poor at the same time. That is backward. It creates a household that looks prudent and may still be fragile. Because here is the part few people appreciate. Extra principal locked in a house is not liquid. If life hits you hard, if the furnace dies, if a child needs help, if you lose work, if you want to invest when markets panic, if an opportunity appears, the equity in the walls does not leap out and help you politely. It sits there. You may be able to access it eventually, perhaps through a sale or a new loan. But access under stress is not the same as having actual liquidity when needed. Liquidity is underrated because it does not photograph well. But liquidity is oxygen. A person with a cheap mortgage, a strong brokerage account, and a real cash reserve is often in a much stronger position than the person who obsessed over owning the house faster while starving everything else. Again, I want to be careful. I am not telling people to borrow recklessly against their homes. I am not telling people to maximize debt as some kind of ideological badge. I am saying if the mortgage is very cheap, then extra payments should be treated as an investment choice, and many people are making a poor investment choice because the psychological satisfaction is louder than the mathematics. That is all. The second kind of debt many people attack too aggressively is federal student loan debt, especially fixed-rate federal loans at ordinary mid-single-digit rates. Now here again, the public language is moral rather than mathematical. Pay off your student loans before you do anything fun, before you invest seriously, before you build wealth, before you relax, before you breathe. That kind of advice has ruined the first 15 or 20 years of adult compounding for a shocking number of people. Let me tell you the ugliest part of all. A 26-year-old paying double and triple on federal student loans while ignoring his employer's retirement match may be making one of the dumbest mathematically respectable decisions in American finance. And yet it is praised constantly. Why? Because eliminating debt looks responsible. Leaving free money from an employer on the table looks invisible. But invisible mistakes still cost real wealth. If your employer offers a 401k match and you do not take it because you are busy racing against a fixed federal loan at 5 or 6%, then you are rejecting an immediate, risk-free, often 50% or 100% return just to feel emotionally cleaner about the liability. That is not maturity. That is confusion, and it gets worse. The money invested in your 20s and 30s is not ordinary money. It is time-rich money. That means each dollar has decades to work. Each early dollar is far more powerful than later dollars because it gets the one thing no advisor, no entrepreneur, no banker, and no billionaire can ever manufacture once it is gone: time when someone spends the prime compounding years overpaying federal student loans instead of building retirement accounts. He is not just reducing a balance faster. He is shrinking the most fertile field his future will ever have. This is why I hate simplistic debt commandments. They make people feel dutiful at the precise moment when they should be thinking in terms of lifetime return. Now, some debts deserve that urgency. Federal student loans are usually not the first place for it. If the rates are reasonable, the terms are fixed, and the borrower still has access to tax-advantaged investing, employer matches, or even forgiveness pathways in some cases. That is another point the public often ignores. Federal student loans are not just loans. They are loans with structures, protections, repayment programs, deferment possibilities, and in some cases strategic optionality that other debts do not offer. That matters. A credit card company will not hold your hand in hardship. A federal student loan system may offer paths that preserve cash flow and reduce immediate pressure. So why would a young person starve his investing, ignore free employer match, and pour his life into early payoff of a non-catastrophic fixed federally structured liability if his expected return elsewhere is likely higher and his compounding window is most valuable right now. He should not. If I were giving such a person a hierarchy, it would be this. Take the employer match first, build a real emergency reserve. Second, use the tax-advantaged accounts intelligently. Make the required student loan payments on time, every time. Then only consider aggressive prepayment after the high return opportunities and the structural protections of the rest of the balance sheet have been respected. That is strategic adulthood, not emotional debt puritanism. The third kind of debt too many people rush to kill is a low-interest auto loan. Now I know the objection already. Cars go down in value. Why would anyone keep debt on a depreciating asset longer than necessary? The answer is not because the car is wonderful. The answer is because the financing may be a bad asset. Financed with very cheap money is still not automatically the first place your extra capital should go. What matters is not whether the car depreciates. Of course it does. What matters is whether prepaying a 3% or 4% car loan is the best use of your marginal dollars if other opportunities, reserves, or higher return investments exist. Most people answer this question emotionally. They hate the feeling of a car payment, so they try to be done with it. But hatred is not a financial model. A person who throws an extra $200 a month at a low-interest auto note is again choosing the avoided rate as his effective return. If the note costs 3.5% and that extra capital could be building reserves, capturing an employer match, funding a Roth IRA, or going into broad low-cost investments likely to compound much higher over time, then his desire to eliminate the payment is understandable and still financially weak. There is a larger lesson here. Cheap debt is a tool, expensive debt is a threat. People keep reversing them because cheap debt offends their emotions and expensive debt often hides behind monthly minimums that look manageable. But a 3% auto note does not threaten your life the way 24% revolving debt does. The car loan is usually not the emergency. The misuse of extra cash flow is. Now again, let me draw the line clearly because the public always loves taking a sensible statement and stretching it into something stupid. I am not saying buy a car you cannot afford because the financing is cheap. That would be idiotic. The vehicle should still fit inside a sane overall budget. I am not saying finance toys endlessly and pretend you are a capital allocator. I am saying once the low-cost loan already exists, do not automatically assume the highest return on every extra dollar is to accelerate that specific payoff. Often it is not. Often the highest return is elsewhere. That is the whole principle running through these first three categories. Low-cost debt with stable terms is not automatically your enemy. It can coexist perfectly well with wealth building. If you stop treating every liability as a moral emergency and start ranking obligations by actual economic cost. Now, if you stop aggressively prepaying these forms of cheap debt, what should the freed money actually do? This is where real wealth begins, because the goal is not merely to not prepay. The goal is to redirect capital intelligently. Capital must go somewhere. If it does not go into excess principal, where does it go? This is the question that separates people who merely stop making a mistake from people who turn the mistake into an advantage. Here is how I think about the hierarchy. First, capture every dollar of employer 401k match available to you. I do not care whether you call yourself conservative or aggressive, or whether the market feels expensive this month. A good employer match is a return structure too attractive to ignore. A man who passes on a 50% or 100% immediate return to pay down cheap debt faster is not being prudent. He is being blind. This is one of those places where the arithmetic is almost too clear. The matched dollar begins its life already ahead. That matters. Second, build an emergency reserve. And do not romanticize this. A reserve is not laziness. A reserve is not uninvested shame. It is what keeps you from turning every small disaster into a financial infection. If you have no reserve, then every setback becomes a debt problem, a forced sale problem, a missed investment problem, or a household stress problem. That is a terrible way to live. Cash reserves buy time. Time buys judgment. Judgment protects wealth. Third, after the match and reserve, use the tax shelters that the system gives you. Roth IRA, if eligible, traditional retirement accounts, where appropriate health savings accounts, if you qualify. These are not bureaucratic footnotes. These are compounding accelerators. Tax treatment matters a lot, especially over decades. The fourth destination is broad low-cost investing itself. And here I prefer boring truth over exciting nonsense. Most people do not need a thrilling portfolio. They need a durable one, broad low-cost index funds, productive ownership, automatic contributions, microscopic fees, decades of compounding. That is how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results. Not because the process sounds glamorous, because the arithmetic works. The source text leans into dividend, paying stocks and dividend ETFs as part of the wealth building redirection, and I understand why. Many investors stay more disciplined when cash flow arrives visibly. There's nothing wrong with using dividend strategies as part of a long-term asset plan if the businesses are high quality and the fees are low. But what matters most is not the branding. It is that the money leaves the low return use and enters a higher return compounding use. Content reference OA site 2 Fei ND 2 Fei 2 Fei. That is the true shift from debt elimination for its own sake to asset accumulation with purpose. That is how wealth is built, not by making the balance sheet look morally tidy while the asset side starves. Now let me turn to the debt that deserves the opposite treatment. High-interest consumer debt. This is the debt that should be attacked with intensity. This is where the moralists accidentally become right. Credit card debt at brutal rates, predatory personal loans, payday structures, buy now pay, ladder strings that function like behavioral traps. Anything north of roughly 8% deserves very hard scrutiny. And once you move into the teens or 20s, you are no longer discussing strategy. You are discussing financial hemorrhaging. This is the debt that keeps people poor even when their income improves. This is the debt that destroys optionality. This is the debt that quietly absorbs all the gains from career progress and then asks for more. When someone is carrying balances at 22, 25, 29%, I do not want to hear about investing genius or rental property dreams or portfolio allocation theory. I want that debt dead. Because the guaranteed return from eliminating that cost is usually better than almost anything else available. The market may average 10% over long periods. Fine. That does not mean you should invest while paying 25% interest on revolving debt and pretend you are being strategic. You are not. You are fighting uphill in sand. High-interest consumer debt is not leverage. It is reverse compounding. And reverse compounding is merciless. The monthly minimum payment is one of the most psychologically dangerous inventions in consumer finance because it makes a mathematically punishing problem look socially manageable. A person thinks he is handling it because the account is still current. But the interest keeps chewing month after month, year after year. Sometimes people carry these balances so long that the debt begins feeling like part of their identity rather than an emergency. That is tragic. The correct way to think about high-interest consumer debt is not as a monthly annoyance. It is as a parasite on future labor, because that is what it is. It feeds on work you have not done yet. It steals flexibility from future you and transfers it to the lender. That is why this debt deserves aggression. Not calm minimums, not delicate strategy. Aggression, list it, rank it by rate. Attack the highest rate first. Make minimums on the rest. Roll freed, up payments downhill as each balance dies. Do not complicate it. Do not sentimentalize it. Do not negotiate with it. Destroy it. That is one place where emotional intensity belongs. People often ask whether they should use the snowball method or the avalanche method. I know the psychology behind the small balance. First argument, and I do not dismiss psychology carelessly, but if we are speaking mathematically, the avalanche approach, highest rate first, is cleaner. Money does not care which balance makes you feel victorious. First, interest does not respect your need for a symbolic win. It keeps charging according to rate. So if the goal is wealth rather than emotional theater, highest rate first is the right idea. Once the expensive debt is gone, then you stop going back. That is the part people miss. They think the payoff event itself is the breakthrough. It is not. The breakthrough is rebuilding behavior, so the debt does not reappear wearing a different purchase and a different excuse. And here I want to say something that many people need to hear. Being debt-free is not the same thing as being wealthy. That confusion has cost people a fortune. I know people with no debt and no assets, no brokerage account, no passive income, no meaningful retirement base, no margin, no compounding machine. They are technically debt-free and financially weak. I know other people carrying very low-cost debt against productive assets, while their investments, businesses, and cash flows grow faster than the cost of capital. They are not debt-free, they are wealthy. The distinction matters because if you aim at the wrong target, you can hit it perfectly and still lose the larger game. The target is not a morally pure statement. The target is freedom. Freedom means margin assets, cash flow, optionality, low stress, the ability to absorb a surprise without chaos, the ability to stop working if necessary, the ability to help family from strength rather than from debt. That is the target. Debt freedom can be part of that. It is not the whole thing. So when I look at a household's finances, I do not begin with the slogan. I begin with the rates. What costs 3%? What costs 5%? What costs 12%? What costs 25%? What can reasonably earn more elsewhere? What destroys wealth every month if left alive? That is how a capital allocator thinks. And if you are trying to build wealth, you must become a capital allocator in your own household. Not a moralist, not a victim of received wisdom, a capital allocator. Because every month you are deciding where the next dollar goes, to principal, to interest, to taxes, to reserves, to broad market assets, to retirement shelters, to lifestyle, to error, to strength. That decision repeated month after month is the whole story. There is no hidden chapter later that undoes it. People always want complexity because complexity makes them feel sophisticated. I prefer clear hierarchies. High interest consumer debt above roughly 8%, especially in the 20s, gets destroyed. Low cost fixed debt below roughly 5% often gets minimum payments while capital flows toward higher return, higher optionality, uses employer. Match gets captured, emergency reserve gets built, tax-advantaged investing gets used, broad productive assets get accumulated. That is enough. It really is. A life can be transformed by that one shift, and because I have seen the alternative, I do not say that lightly. I have seen households making minimums on credit cards while overpaying mortgages because the mortgage felt like real debt and the cards felt like modern life. That is upside down. I have seen young professionals starve retirement accounts while proudly annihilating federal loans years ahead of schedule. That is expensive virtue. I have seen men in their 40s pay off cheap car notes early while holding too little liquidity and wondering why every surprise still feels like a crisis. That is misplaced discipline. What matters is not whether you are disciplined. What matters is where the discipline is pointed. If it is pointed at the wrong target, all you are doing is becoming extremely efficient at staying smaller than necessary. I do not want that for anyone who is actually trying to build. So if I had to reduce the whole subject to one plain rule, it would be this. Stop paying extra on the debts that are cheap enough to coexist with wealth and start directing that energy toward assets and reserves that make wealth inevitable over time. At the same time, attack the debts that compound against you faster than you can reasonably compound for yourself. That is the dividing line. Cheap strategic debt can be carried. Expensive consumer debt must be killed. Everything else is emotional noise wrapped around arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike the culture, does not care how virtuous you feel while making the wrong move. It only shows you the ending. If you want a better ending, rank your debts honestly. Redirect your cash flow intelligently and stop confusing debt elimination with wealth creation. They are not the same thing. They never were. And the sooner you stop pretending they are, the faster your money starts working for you instead of merely cleaning up your feelings.